Hello, everyone. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, from the IATEFL YLTSIG committee. I'm Joan Kang Shin, the online events coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome Nicky Hockly, who is our May webinar speaker. Let me just introduce you a little bit to Nicky. Nicky Hockly is Director of Pedagogy of the Consultants E and has been involved in ELT since 1987. She is author of several prize-winning methodology books about technology in EFL, and she gives plenary talks and runs training courses all over the world. Nicky lives in Barcelona and is a technophobe turned technophile. I really relate to that, and maybe some of you do too. So we're very lucky, very excited to have Nicky with us today. And without further ado, over to you, Nicky.
Thank you very much, Joan, for that lovely introduction, and hello to everybody from all over the world. I'm based in Barcelona in Spain, by the way. You can tell by the bright light coming in through my window that it's a nice sunny day here. I've just had lunch. So welcome. Lovely to see you here. There are a few names that I recognize, which is lovely. And I hope that you will be with us for the whole hour. This talk, really, I'd like to look at teenagers or secondary school aged learners, aged approximately 13 to 18. So in the United States, this is called middle school and high school. And in Europe, we usually refer to this age group as secondary school learners. So I'll be using the word secondary teenagers kind of interchangeably during the session. First of all, can I just check how many of you are secondary school or teenage age learner English teachers? If you look above the slides, there's a black toolbar and there's a little sort of figure with a hand held up like that. If you click on the arrow next to it, you'll get a drop-down menu and you can agree or disagree. So if you teach secondary school students, could you click on agree? And if you don't teach secondary school students, aged students, could you click on disagree? So the black toolbar at the top, you'll see that there's a figure with a raised hand like this. See it in the camera. Click on the arrow next to that, drop down menu, and you will see little icons for agree and disagree. Just give you a minute. So we've got most of you are clicking agree. I'm hoping that some of you just haven't found the icon. So we're waiting there. Top black toolbar, there's a figure with a hand. Click on the arrow, you'll get a drop-down menu and click on agree or disagree. Okay. Well, while you look for that, I'll carry on. The idea then is really to look at this age group for English language teachers and think about the technologies that seem to be most effective when we're teaching English to secondary school learners. But to start off with, I'd like to find out what you think about teenagers and technologies. And even if you don't teach teenagers, you'll probably have an opinion, especially if you have teenage children. So Joan's going to pull up a poll for us, and there are a number of statements. There are 8 statements, and you're going to click on the ones that you agree with. So if you disagree, don't click. Just click on the ones that you agree with, and then you can submit your answer. And then we'll see how many of these statements are agreed with and which seem to be the most agreeable, as it were. So you should be able to see that. Okay, I think we need to just open the poll. There we go. So you should see 8 statements there, and you can click on the ones that you agree with. I'll give you a minute because some of them you need to think about a little bit. Now you should be seeing the results broadcast on the screen. So for example, at the moment, number 1, we've got 2 people who agree with that. For number 2, at the moment, we've got 5 people, but it'll change as you vote. So agree, click on any that you agree with and ignore those that you disagree with. Okay, Oh, by the way, number 7, there's an acronym there, which is MMORPGs. If anybody knows what that acronym is, then please put it in the chat window. It's a type of online game. Okay, so click on those that you agree with. And MMORPG is massively multiplayer online role-playing games. So those are those kind of, online games where lots of people take part at the same time. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games. So number 7 is MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, can support teens' English language learning. Agree or disagree? So click on those that you agree with. Okay. Now, I think most of us have probably had time to, I've got my mobile phone here, and I'm just going to quickly take a photo of those results, because we're going to come back to these later, and we'll see to what extent the voting has changed. Okay, seemed easier to take a photo than a screenshot. Great. All right, so we're going to end the poll, and we will come back to it. Just get rid of it. Thanks. Thanks, Joan. Great. Okay. Now, before we start looking through those statements, I'd like to just discuss some of the background issues involved in teenagers and technology. I think these are issues that form the backdrop to really any use of technology that you may be using or doing with your students in the English language classroom. And the first one is this idea of technology at school. Now, you may find that you work in a school where students' use of their own personal devices is banned, or perhaps you work in a school where students can bring their own devices, often mobile devices. There was an interesting study carried out in 2015, an ethnographic study in the USA. There were 2 schools. It was an urban school and a suburban school, so again, secondary age learners. And the researchers looked at to what extent students were using their own personal technology at school, although both schools had banned the use of students' technology. Students weren't allowed to bring mobile devices or any technology to school. And they found that actually students found all sorts of ways to get around the ban, and they were using their devices in school constantly for sort of socializing and texting and so on, and checking Facebook or whatever they did, plus for some work things in the breaks and stuff. Both schools had some technology already, what they called school-sanctioned technologies in the school. For example, students could go to the computer room during class, and teachers could take the students and they could do like quizzes or multiple choice or use programs there. And they also had a number of interactive whiteboards installed in the classroom. The researchers noticed that the use of the school-sanctioned technology tended to be extremely traditional, in that it was teacher-led, it was top-down, and it was very much sort of evaluation-based rather than kind of using technology in creative ways. But the point here really is that, technology is at school, whether it's school-sanctioned or even if students' devices are banned, they will find a way to use them. And researchers suggest that this is something that we need to keep in mind, that we need to not close ourselves off to students bringing their own technologies at school, but rather find more creative and interesting ways to integrate them into what we do. They weren't talking about English language, by the way, they were talking just generally. Okay, another issue is this idea of screen time, which I'm sure you've heard. There's a lot of concern about this in the media, that kids today, smaller kids and teenagers are all spending far too much time looking at screens. There is some legitimate concern over this. For example, the Alliance for Childhood have carried out studies, and they've found that excessive screen time, I'll come back to that word excessive in a minute, excessive screen time can have health risks. For example, obvious ones, obesity, because kids are not getting up. It can involve sleep disturbance, it can affect learning, it can affect attention, so kids can find that they have less attention for school, and also even provoke social problems. But there's a lot of discussion about what excessive means, how many hours a day is excessive, and what is happening during screen time. I mean, what are kids actually doing while they're on their devices? this is an important thing to keep in mind. Often they're doing homework or researching stuff or using it in social ways. And we're going to come back to that anyway a while as well. So again, often in the press, there's this kind of moral panic or hysteria about screen time. But the issue itself is probably a little bit more nuanced. We need to look at how kids are using devices, not the fact that they're using them for X number of hours a day. The issue of e-safety, I'm sure if you teach younger kids or teenagers, is something that you're very familiar with. It's in most school curricula, I think, these days, that we need to teach kids about cyberbullying and safety online and, appropriate behavior online and so on and so forth. With teenagers, there's an interesting dimension added because of the age group, of course. They are often exploring their own identity through online communication with others. And we come across sort of more, let's say, complicated or challenging e-safety issues. For example, sexting. Sexting is a phenomenon which is fairly widespread. Again, research has found that 1 out of 5 US teenagers has been involved in sexting. That's a pretty high percentage, 1 in 5, 20%. This is a felony in most countries. And often teachers are faced with these kinds of behaviors, but with very little knowledge of how to approach them, and also very little knowledge of the legal implications of this kind of thing. So there are researchers who talk about the fact that teachers today of teenagers probably need a kind of legal literacy. They need to be aware of these kinds of inappropriate practices online and what the implications are for kids, and to be able to deal with them, which is not that straightforward. So again, e-safety is a fairly complex area when we come to teenagers. The next point there is this idea of friendship-driven online practices. Essentially, teenagers tend to use devices, and we're talking mainly about mobile devices these days, for friendship-driven uses, so for social contact with others. Obviously, they use them for a wide range of things, but in this age group, one of the prime drivers is this idea of friendship-driven practices. Again, something for us to keep in mind, the social aspect of technology and its massive importance for teenagers. And this links into this next point here, the idea of online identity. Teenagers are forging their identities really through online contact with others. These may be friends that they see face to face at school or in their neighborhood, but their relationships are often being held online as well as face to face. They're exploring their identities, they're forging friendships, they're often losing friendships online, and this is also a result perhaps of the fact that kids, particularly in, let's say, my context here in Spain, in Europe, and in North America, Canada, and the USA, kids have less and less public spaces in which to meet. They're allowed out less and less. They don't hang around the mall as much as they used to back in my day. Kids are often kept busy, not only at school during the day, in these very controlled spaces, but then they have these extramural activities, and they have very little space in which to connect with others. And again, this drives all of this kind of socializing behavior online, which is not a bad thing. But it's important for us to remember that kids, teenagers especially, are forging their identities online, even if it's with people that they interact with regularly face to face, not necessarily with strangers. In fact, they interact much less with strangers than they do with people they already know. The final background point I want to make is this idea of text speak, or abbreviations that we use, for example, in texting, and the idea of technolects, which are the different genres of language that we use in online communication. And I'll come back to that. I just want to say that the position for teachers at the moment is, rather than us teaching our kids to write text speak in English as a kind of a genre, because we have these different genres, texting, Facebook status update, an email, they all require very different uses of English, right? Rather than trying to teach our kids all of those different genres as independent things or canons, one way to approach this is to put kids or teenagers in real communicative events online, so to set up activities that require real online communication, and then to teach the genres or the languages that are appropriate to those communicative events. This is much more of a kind of a social practice view of literacy. So literacy is a result of social practices rather than, a set of body of knowledge that we have to teach in isolation, unconnected to what happens in real life. So those are just a few of the sort of background points that I wanted to make. I'll try to keep an eye as well on the text chat as we go through. Yes, thank you, Joan. The idea of construction of online identities. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so over to you. I've been talking for a good 5 minutes. If you'd like to answer one or both of these questions or none in the chat window. If you do use technologies with your secondary aged learners, then just let us know briefly what you do. And if you have any sort of especially effective or what seem to you effective technology-based activities with your secondary age learners, let us know and why you think they're effective. So I was going to pause for a minute and have a cup of tea, which I have with me. So Praveen uses SMS. Praveen, could you let us know what you use it for and how? Okay, Joan has her students writing blogs. We're going to talk about blogs actually in a bit more detail. Yeah. So Amanda's used iPads. Okay, was a little short on ideas. All right, yeah. I think it's probably not so much the technology as actually the use, right, Amanda? I think it sounds like you found out the hard way. All right, so IAT has used an Instagram album. Great. Okay, we're going to talk about things like Instagram as well in a second. All right, Maria Anna, collaborative writing using Padlet or Linoid, which is an online kind of sticky notice board, sticky note notice board. Melissa's used Kahoot, which is a quiz app. Edmodo, kind of a learning environment and apps. Okay. Oh, Praveen's explaining there the use of SMS, right? Simple answers to questions posed. Yeah, all right. Moving and recycling, WhatsApp, videos, Kahoot. Yes, there's been a kind of a Kahoot craze in the profession, hasn't there? It's a kind of an app which allows you to do real-time quizzes, and students use their mobile devices and they can send the answers and they're displayed in real time on the board. A bit like what we did before with the poll, actually, but it looks a little jazzier. Yes, I mean, I think these things have limited use, but they can make a class briefly interesting. Recording audio, okay, photos from mobile devices, great. QR codes, lovely. All right, lots of experience, excellent. Great. Lovely. Okay, none of you have really answered the question why there, which is why some of these activities that you're suggesting seem to work well. You've given quite a few examples. We've got QR codes, various apps, Padlet, so on. But why are these things working or not working? Okay, Praveen says immediate feedback. Yeah, in the case of something like Kahoot, yeah, possibly. Okay, Praveen writes, so 24/7 learning, so yeah, they have access to this technology all the time and out of the classroom. Yeah, good point. Melissa's students love competition. Okay. Yeah, so I can imagine something like Kahoot's quite effective. Okay, please carry on if you have any more suggestions or comments in the chat window, and I'm going to move along just because we have a time limit here. So this was the first question that you had in the poll, if you'll remember. The vast majority of teens are proficient technology users, and let me just remind myself how many of you agreed with that. Let's have a look. We had 3 people agreed with that. Okay. Well, this is a tricky one. I think we tend to think that this is true, don't we? Or certainly, you always hear people saying, "Oh, my kid's amazing with technology. My 3-year-old niece is brilliant on the iPad and design robots and whatever." Although this comes back to this idea of the digital native and the digital immigrant, terms that were popularized by Mark Prensky in around 2001. But I think this idea of kids being digital so-called natives, so they naturally take to technology, and older people being digital so-called immigrants is being completely debunked. This is something that is not really generally accepted anymore. It seemed to sum up the zeitgeist in about 2001, But these days, this doesn't seem to really reflect reality. I want to share with you a very interesting study that was carried out. This was in 2013, the reference is there, Freylon et al. It was carried out by the International Association for the Evaluation of Education Achievement, IEA. And it looked at the extent to which teenagers were, or secondary school learners, were digitally literate around the world. So the numbers on this research study are impressive. 60,000 students, not bad, 60,000 students aged 13 to 14, which is grade 8. 3,300 schools took part in the study. This meant 21 different education systems or countries, and there was additional data from 25,000 teachers, school principals, and school ICT coordinators. And the idea was to kind of, figure out if this is true, just to what extent teenagers really are proficient technology users. In the sample, in the study, they included external things like students' characteristics, especially their academic achievement, also the home context and the school context, because obviously there are big differences in 21 countries. The way they ran the study was that the students were given 4 practical tasks, and they were very practical in terms of students needing to use technology to create something. So, for example, one of the tasks was that they had to work and to create a website or a web page, which was about a school band competition. Another task included collecting and managing information so that they could then create a presentation about breathing, which could then be delivered to 9-year-olds. So you can see fairly complex tasks here, not just being able to click on a computer screen. There were 4 tasks in total of this type, and the students were each randomly allocated 2 of the 4 tasks. Now the results were interesting. They mapped the results on a proficiency scale from 4 to 1, with 1 being the sort of lowest level of proficiency with technology, not language, lowest level of proficiency, and 4 being the highest level of proficiency with technology. And the results were 81% of these students were in levels 1 to 3. 1 is the lowest, 4 is the highest. 81% in levels 1 to 3, with the majority of that 81% at level 2, which is not very high at all. What they noticed positively affected the results, or made students sort of more proficient, if you like, was their educational attainment, so whether they were good students or not, their parents' educational level. This was also another important factor. The number of books in the house, in the home. Interesting, huh? Whether they had ICT training or classes at school, that kind of makes sense. And also things like access to ICT resources at home. But this particular factor was undercut if students were from a lower socioeconomic status environment. So interesting. I mean, I think that's interesting in that, it does totally debunk this idea that students are all proficient technology users. Most of them are comfortable technology users, and they all seem to have a PhD in Instagram. But how proficient and how effective are they as users? How savvy are they? They're not great at finding or checking sources online, for example. They're not great at using email. So we need to remember that the scenario is a little bit more complex than we might otherwise expect. Okay. How proficient are your secondary aged learners? There's another poll that we have here very quickly, and it'll be a bit like Kahoot, but without the colors. There we go. So you should be able to choose one answer here. So depending on your students, generalizing, of course, you're going to have students that are a bit of everything. But if you had to generalize about your own students, which of these statements is the closest? Okay, so at the moment we've got the kind of they're okay, and they're mostly pretty good. Okay. Remember that the results of that study with 60,000 students would have put us between they're okay and they're not that good. That would be where the results mainly are. Okay, and we've got they're okay as the most common. Yeah, so we're sort of reflecting the results of that. in any case, it would be an interesting thing to carry out with your students. If you look up that study and try out some of those tasks, see how your students get on. You may be surprised that they're not that proficient with technology. Okay. All right, Joan, shall we pull back the poll and we'll move on? All right, this was the next statement that we had. Teens love using technology to support their language learning. And we had most people agreeing with that one, I think. Okay, well, really the answer here is that it depends, right? It depends on what technology and how you use it, because technology can be used in fairly dull ways or in fairly effective ways. We had some very good examples, for example, in the chat window earlier of effective uses. What's interesting here is that research has also found that not all teenagers want the social technologies that they use in their out-of-school lives, which are so important to them. They don't want them appropriated and used in kind of formal learning contexts like the classroom. So if they're using Instagram out of class and that's an important part of their online identities and their online social connections, as we discussed earlier, then they don't really want to see that, being forced down their throats to use as part of their English language learning. Or they might want to, but I think the important thing is here that we cannot assume that technologies that our students use in their personal lives are immediately co-optable into the language classroom. We probably need to check with our students first. There's an interesting study, for example, carried out with games where sounds like games, I'm talking about educational games, right? Not Angry Birds or something, or Candy Crush. Educational games are something that can be very engaging for learners. There's a lot of very positive research around it. But studies have also found that not all learners want their language ability to be evaluated through the use of games, because especially high achieving students who work well within the traditional system and the exam system, they feel that their traditional learning and that their academic abilities are not being fairly assessed. So again, it's this idea of, one size fits all. It's not quite that simple. There are often students who resent this kind of thing, the outside life being brought into the classroom, especially if they function well in a standard or traditional academic environment. Food for thought. Okay, a question for you. Again, if you could just put your answer in the chat window. How would or do your teenage students respond to using their technologies? I think somebody mentioned using Instagram before. Might have been IAT, actually. Yes, IAT suggested that she uses Instagram. And how do they respond? Or how would they respond if you don't do this yet? So IAT, for you, it seems that this co-opting of their technology seems to work quite well. And Praveen says novelty can arouse their interest initially, yeah, although that's never a long-term strategy, is it? The wow factor. I mean, I think the point, what the research says here is that you need to kind of explore this with your students. So you could try out using their technologies, but then find out what they really think about it and how effective they really find it. Okay, Melissa uses WhatsApp. Okay, they take pictures of your board work. All right. Yes, I've spoken to several teachers and I've used WhatsApp as well. That can work extremely effectively, but it depends on the group. Yeah, Michaela, exactly. They would like to use technology, but not for studying or learning. Yes, it depends on the students. Again, I'm just trying to present a slightly more nuanced picture of all of this than we are often presented with. All right, I'm aware that time is knocking on, so I'm going to move on to the next one. So, text speak is eroding writing standards. Well, for this one, this is pretty clearly been shown not to be the case by research. Again, there was a lot of kind of moral panic about this a few years ago, but this has been totally debunked. I mean, for example, the writing of people like David Crystal, His opinions on this are quite well known. There was also an interesting study which is referenced there, Plesser and Wood, which found that there's a positive correlation between the ability to use text speak and standard spelling conventions at school. And this was carried out among preteens in the UK. So I think the idea of this idea of code switching, that kids are and teenagers are perfectly aware of and able to code switch between the kinds of writing used in text speak and the kinds of writing that are used in exams. So the idea that they're eroding writing standards is simply just not borne out by the evidence. No ESL situations, no as well, Praveen. If they're taught both forms, there's no problem. Kids can code switch and they can deal with ambiguity in the most part. Okay, but however, there is this feeling, isn't it? We often have this as teachers. If a student, slips in a U instead of a YOU in exam, it's, time for total panic. So we often resist this idea that the research seems to show that text speak doesn't affect literary standards. So how do you feel about that? I see Praveen's feeling a bit resistant because he feels it might be different in ESL situations. But no, not necessarily. So if you'd like to just put yes or no in the chat window for this question, have a little think. When I've just presented you with the research, but even then, you may not believe it. Okay, so I've just realized actually this question, the way it's phrased, is quite difficult to unpick, right? Do you agree with the research that it doesn't affect literary standard? That negative in there kind of throws the meaning of the sentence a little bit. So basically the research is saying text speak doesn't affect literacy standards. And you don't agree. Okay, it's there. Read David Crystal's work if you don't agree, okay, is what I can say. Yeah, have a look at David Crystal. He has a book, I think, called Text Speak, 2006. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't convince you, all of you, on that one. This was another one of the statements that we had. Secondary students prefer reading short English texts on cell phones rather than via email or on paper. This kind of speaks to some of the comments we've seen before in the chat window, that you're saying students really like using their own technologies. They can't be separated from their technologies, especially mobile devices these days. So in theory, this should be true, right? If they can't be separated from their technologies. Well, this was an interesting little study that was carried out. Got some notes here so I can remember the numbers involved. This was a very small scale study. It was carried out with 10 EFL students in Taiwan, 12th grade. So that would be like, what, 16, 17, something like that. And the aim of the study was to explore their preferences, right? To see if they preferred reading shorter or longer texts on cell phones versus email or paper. And they also, the researchers wanted to look at what the students perceived as the advantages and disadvantages to using mobiles for this. The students received shorter texts and longer texts, and they were delivered through all three medium, so paper, email, cell phone, and the students could read them anytime, alone, at their own pace, not in school. Then the researchers gave the students some questionnaires to get their opinions, and also got them to write summaries of the text to check that they'd actually understood the content. The findings were that the majority preferred paper for both texts, shorter texts and longer texts, the majority, but actually the difference was not significant. They found that the majority preferred cell phones over email for the shorter texts, and they preferred paper or email over the cell phones for the longer texts. I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? Because of the small screen size and the font, you don't want to be scrolling through long text forever and ever. But the researchers said this was interesting, because it sort of bore out what one would expect, but not quite. The sample size was obviously very small, so this is an area that might be interesting for further research. So if you're interested in carrying out action research with your own secondary school age students, this is the kind of fairly straightforward study that you could replicate. The references there at the bottom, by the way. Just read how the researchers did it and do the same thing with your students and see what you get. Might be quite interesting. Okay. What do you think? I mean, I know you haven't carried out the study with your students, but what do you think? Which would they prefer? Your students, what would they prefer for shorter text? Short text in the study, by the way, was shorter texts were about 50 to 60 words. It's pretty short. And longer texts were 800 to 900 words. So that was the length. So what do you think? Which medium would your students prefer for the shorter texts? Oh, okay. We've got 60% of you more or less thinking cell phone and 40%-ish thinking paper. It's quite close. And one of you thinking email. Okay, we're talking about the shorter ones, yeah, the shorter text, 50 to 60 words. Okay, well, that's interesting. Really split vote. Just give you a minute to vote if you haven't. All right, so cell phone is just winning, but it's very split. So this would be a really interesting little study to carry out with your own students. Again, replicating what was carried out in Taiwan and see what your students think. It's pretty interesting to do and pretty easy to do. Okay. Yeah, Amanda, you think paper would be preferred. Something to try with your students. Often we get results that we don't quite expect when we carry out classroom research. Okay, blogs and wikis can help develop students' writing skills. Yes, the research, there's been quite a lot of research into this over the years because these tools have been around for so long. They were some of the first Web 2.0 tools that were available. For blogs, definitely. I mean, the advantage for blogs really is that you're writing for a real audience. You've got a real communicative purpose for your writing. I mean, somebody's going to read it. And you can, in theory, interact with your readership via the comments. So it's a different thing, writing in a blog to writing on a piece of paper for the teacher. Very different. So motivation is certainly higher. The research seems to bear this out. Students are more motivated to write in blogs, pretty much across the board. But there was an interesting study carried out by Cercu, there's the name in the screen there, in Belgium. And there the findings were that students with lower proficiency seemed to benefit less. So like the stronger students tended to write more frequently, comment on each other's work in blogs, and their writing seemed to improve a bit. The lower proficiency students, they tended not to write as much. They didn't want to write. They tried to avoid writing. They limited themselves to comments on their peers' blogs if they had to write something. But generally, they didn't feel that their writing improved as much. So the conclusions from the study, as Cercu says, is that blogs seem to work for some students, but not for others. So there is generally a very positive press for blogs in the research, but it is sometimes a little bit more nuanced than we might expect. Motivation is affected, but it doesn't necessarily improve the quality of all students' writing. These are two different things, motivation for writing and the quality of the language produced. If you're interested, take a look at the study. It's an interesting one. Wikis, again, also the research seems to find that wikis support collaborative writing. So you get a lot of redrafting and improving of text. But this only works if tasks are designed that are sort of relevant and they're effective and they actually require students to redraft and improve the writing. But again, they seem to have pretty good potential. So overall, these tools seem to be effective in terms of supporting students' writing as a general rule. What about you? Have you used blogs or wikis with your students? And if so, how? Joan, I know you have. And has anybody else? And what do you do with them? Right, Tiziana is just saying there that started blogging. The young students don't love it. That's interesting. Why not? Why is that, do you think? And Joan, if you would like to share with us what you do with your students blogging, just generally. Grazie, yes, absolutely. Depends on teacher facilitation and also depends on task design, right? Because if you're getting your students to write, dull blog posts on topics that nobody cares about or is interested in reading, it just doesn't matter what tool you're using if the task is not effective. Okay, so Ayat, you found it worked more with adults and less with teens. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that might be. Because Joan was saying she uses blogs with her teens. So it might not be an issue of age. Tiziana, they're not used to it. Okay. So you provide them videos or short texts, yeah. And that's also an interesting point, like how much are you asking the students to write? If they have to write long, advantages, disadvantages essays, I mean, that's not exactly the most motivating task, either for the writer or the reader. Yeah, Letizia, well, I know some of you are using blogs. Okay, so Joan's using it as an exchange between classrooms. So that's an interesting kind of context, right? They're finding out about students in different parts of the world. Yeah, it doesn't have to be public, but they're reading each other's, right, within the two classes, photos, video, text. The multimedia or multimodal aspect of blogs is what's interesting as well. It's not just text, right? Okay. So yeah, collaboration, grazie. Great. I mean, again, these two are tools that have been around for quite a while. And they still are effective for language learners on the whole. Okay, again, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to whip along. This is interesting. Using text chat in English can support secondary students' speaking skills. So we're talking about two different skills. Text chat, so typing, writing, can support speaking skills. So basically we're saying here, writing something can support speaking skills. Is that true? I don't remember how many of you agreed or disagreed with this, but this is a very, very interesting study. I have to say, if I find studies like this interesting, it probably suggests I need to get out more. But I found this really fascinating. Text chat or text speak. It has these sort of speech-like characteristics. That's what David Crystal calls them. Text chat has speech-like characteristics. For example, we use emoticons for prosodic features, for example, intonation and tone, which will get across emotion. In spoken language, we use emoticons in text speak for that. We can use things like caps for loudness, even. So it has these interesting features. There was a very interesting study carried out about whether text chat and voice chat activities could affect speaking proficiency and anxiety about speaking, right? For secondary school students when they're faced with speaking tasks. I found this just fascinating. This is 90 students in Turkey. They were aged 16 to 17, a low level. Again, this is interesting. Low level. Obviously, the lower the level, the less proficient and the less confident you are with speaking in English and the more anxious you are. It was a 4-week study. The researchers put the 90 students into 3 different groups with 30 students in each group. So group 1, 30 students, was an experimental group, and they had 40 to 45 minutes of text chat activities in pairs, okay, text typing. The second experimental group, again 30 students, they spent 40 to 45 minutes on voice chat activities in pairs. Okay, so we've got a text chat group, a voice chat group. The third group of 30 students was the control group, so they did nothing. Well, they did normal language learning, if you like, normal in inverted commas language learning activities, but they didn't do this stuff. The kinds of activities the students did with the text chat or the voice chat were kind of jigsaw tasks, decision-making tasks, information gap tasks, and problem solving. So they had to really use the language to communicate, whether text or voice. The data was collected. They did pre- and post-treatment anxiety scales to check how anxious students felt about speaking, and they also gave them speaking tests, so a baseline speaking test and a speaking test at the end of the treatment, and they also gave the students questionnaires to find out their self-reported anxiety and so on. The results were interesting. The speaking proficiency of both of the experimental groups increased. So the group who was using text chat and the group who was using voice chat, their speaking proficiency increased. Good. But there was a decrease in the anxiety levels only for the text chat experimental group. So the group that was using typing, text chat, their anxiety levels decreased. The voice chat group, their anxiety levels didn't decrease. So the text chat group basically felt, they also said they felt more confident about the possibility of having to speak to people in English, which they didn't have to do. They lived in Turkey. They didn't have much interaction with English speakers. So the researchers are basically suggesting here, what they say is that for low-level EFL students, teenagers, it actually might be beneficial to start them off with interacting in pairs via text chat before they start doing speaking activities. And this can help quite effectively with anxiety. Interesting, huh? I thought that was fascinating. So here's a question for you. Have you used text chat programs with your secondary students? And if so, what chat programs and how? I know some of you have already mentioned WhatsApp, a group messaging app, but it's using text chat. So I think that would fit the bill here. It depends what kinds of activities you're doing with it, though, because remember the research, they had problem solving, jigsaw, information gap, and decision-making tasks. So depending on how you're using your text chats. Grazia, yes, you've seen this, right? Yeah, you acquire confidence through text writing. I think the argument here is that text chat has these speech-like features. So rather than blog writing for increasing speaking confidence, we're talking about text chat genres for increasing speaking confidence. Okay, I've only got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to just move on. Anyway, again, try this out with your students. See what happens. Set up a control group and two experimental groups in the control group. This is not a difficult piece of research to replicate as part of your own classroom research. Okay, I'm being chivied along, so I'm going to quickly whip over to this one. The MMORPGs, the massively multiplayer online role-playing games, can support teenagers' English language learning. So this picture is from a game called World of Warcraft. People get online, you can work in these huge groups online, you have to do stuff, you have to find stuff, you have to fight enemies, you have to find, carry out quests to find things, and they're fairly complex games. And you usually actually text chat. And you can use voice, but most people use text to play this particular game. And again, there's been some interesting research into this. Sundqvist in Sweden has written some really interesting stuff about this. Just to very briefly summarize this, she's found that students' vocabulary increases. It's a good way for students to acquire vocabulary. She did a research study which lasted a year with 80 students aged 15 to 16 in Sweden. And the gamers in the study who played these kinds of games regularly, their vocabulary acquisition was way above everybody else's vocabulary acquisition. What was interesting about this, though, was the difference in gender. And that is that in her study, the girls tended to spend 0.7 hours a week on these games, digital games, and the boys tended to spend 7.4 hours a week. Okay, so that's more than 7 times doing it. And the boys had a much higher vocabulary acquisition load there. Also, what was interesting was the types of games that were played, very clear gender difference. The girls tended to play games like The Sims, which is much more interaction between a single player and the computer. And the boys in this study tended to play these collaborative games like World of Warcraft, where they were doing interaction. So the results of this show that obviously digital games that require interaction and use of the language are more likely to support language learning than games where you don't actually interact apart from clicking a few things. That's pretty sensible results, I think, and fits in with what we know about second language acquisition, really. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up here. Do any of you use digital games with your learners? And there should be a poll here that we can just quickly answer. Joan, do you want to pull up the poll for me here? Thanks. Let's have a look. You can answer, choose as many of these statements as you like. Okay, that's interesting. The majority of you have chosen that you'd encourage your students to play them at home. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, and in fact, not all of our students are gamers, are they? Or interested in games. If you're interested in exploring the area of digital games with your students in class, there's a wonderful book called Digital Play by Graham Stanley and Kyle Moore. If anybody knows the name of it, if you want to just type it in the chat there for me, just by typing so dreadful. Digital Play, Graham Stanley and Kyle Moore. Got some fantastic ideas for using digital games with a range of ages, from very young children, actually, from like 5-6-year-olds right up to teens and adults. Lots of great stuff in there. All right, so most of you would get your students playing games at home. Thank you. All right, Joan, if we just pull the poll down and I'll zip along. Just the last point I want to make, this idea of technology effectively supporting special educational needs students' learning. The research is pretty clear on this. It does support and can support, especially tablet technology, mobile technology. This is just a screenshot from my own iPhone to show you some of the accessibility features in the iPhone. I'm not going to go into this. If you're interested in this area, there's a link there on the slide, which is an article I wrote for the English Language Teaching Journal in 2016, which reviews all of the research into this and summarizes it. So that's something you can look at in your own time if you're interested. I'll just give you a chance to write down that URL if you want it, or to take a photo of it. Quicker. And then just to quickly ask you if you or your secondary students have any experience of using these assistive technologies. It's going to depend on your context. If you could just say yes or no in the chat window. Praveen, yes. Okay. It's going to depend on your students. Okay. Well, you've got a link on the previous slide if it's an area that you would like to look at in a little bit more detail, but we are running out of time, so I'm going to move along. Okay, let's go back to our questions from the beginning, which was the first poll, the 8 statements that we've just reviewed.
And let me clear the results.
And I'd like you to take the poll again, because you may find that you've changed your mind on some of these, or not. Let's reopen.
Edit.
Okay, we might have to try and clear the results
There.
here. Joan?
Yes.
I think there may be a way. I'll leave that with you. I know we're both trying to click on the poll at the same time. Yes, we're both clicking on the poll at the same time, which is not working. But I have the original results here. I took a photo. Great. Oh, lovely. Great. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind everybody clicking on those that you agree with, and we'll see if there is a change. Okay, so yeah, we had 3 people agreeing with number 1 originally. Now we have 1. We had 10 people agreeing with number 2 originally. Now we have 5 people changing their minds. For number 3, we originally had 2 people, so that stays the same. Oh, that should be 0. Didn't do a very good job of convincing you. For number 4, we had 6 originally. And now we have 5. Okay, for number 5. Blocks and wikis. We had oh, for number 5. We had
Sorry,
5
was it a
people.
question? I just
Sorry. Yeah, 5 people. 6 for the next one and
I
8.
don't
Okay,
think
so the
that
results have
we
changed a little bit, but
confer a
not that
certificate
much.
for this webinar.
Okay, but some people have
I don't
changed
know
their
if
position
another
in some of these, which is great.
YLTSIG committee
Good. Can we
member
end the poll there, Joan?
can answer that, but I don't think there's a certificate. We
Thanks.
do have
Okay,
a
we've got a
recording
few more
that will be
minutes left for
posted
questions, but before we
so
do
that
that,
people
just to
can
encourage you, if you'd
watch it
like to
again.
find out sort of or get activities for things that you can do with students practically in the classroom,
We just have about 3 minutes left. Okay.
sharing anything